If you look at a map, they drew an artificial.
So you're gonna react to this?
For laughing at me. I'm gonna sit with you this.
Why
The evil laugh.
China European Union.
Because I wanted to react to this video, but I don't know why it's popping. Yes, we're reacting to that. I was supposed to react alone, but because you laugh at me, it's your punishment.
Man, I'm gonna be a statue.
By William C. Fox channel.
Wait, I thought you already part of the European Union because you have the same queen.
As the UK? Well, no, technically no, because we're not in Europe, but I know what you mean, like, okay, well, anyway, guys, this is what the video is gonna be, okay? Oh my God. Okay, let's go.
If you look at a map, they drew an artificial line right through it between Canada and the US. Just a straight artificial line. Somebody did it a long time ago.
Troubles with the United States have led to suggestions that Canada could become the European Union's 28th member. Canada isn't even in Europe, you say, but if you look at it from this angle,
Why doesn't he give Texas back to Mexico then? To Mexico?
well, okay, Canada still isn't in Europe, but it also isn't as disconnected from the continent as standard maps make it seem. Consider that a recent poll
He's not even wrong if you think about it.
True.
Someone historically decided that countries were divided, right? He's not wrong about that it's arbitrary that people conquer and then they divide their country to country, right?
Yeah.
He's not wrong. But his solution is let's invade Canada. That's his solution, to that. Instead of saying, well, let's just accept everyone everywhere and remove the border for goods because it's useless. It's like, no, we're going to invade even more and create an even bigger barrier,
polls suggested more Canadians support the idea of joining the EU than oppose. Obviously not conclusive, but it speaks to openness to unprecedented ideas in unprecedented times. So what challenges would Canada face joining the EU in increasing
guy's a
order
great
of
voice.
difficulty? If Canada joined the European Union, it would immediately become the fifth largest member by population, 39 million. Currently, Germany is the EU member with the most people, 84 million, about double Canada's population. France is currently
Damn.
the largest.
But that make you see how small Europe is because Canada, 40 millions. We always say that Canada, like I'm from Canada, we live in Thailand, that Canada is a small country in terms of population, right?
Yeah.
Even Thailand is like 80 million. So a lot of countries in Europe, they're so small.
True.
Canada would be the fifth biggest in population,
Yeah,
which is
and
crazy.
Was it big at land?
Oh, by far. But in Canada, it's kind of deceiving because 70%, 80% we live near the US border. And the whole half or the whole 70% up, it's so cold. There's not a lot of people living there.
By area, 540,000 square kilometers or 210,000 square miles. If Canada joined, it would be far and away the largest EU country by area, roughly 10 million square kilometers or 3.8 million square miles. In fact, Canada is over
Wait,
double
what is
the
the white
size of the
thing?
current European.
Greenland. It's because it's owned by Denmark, but now Trump wants to buy it.
Oh wait, basically, see, you can be a European country really easy.
Technically, do we touch Greenland?
Yeah.
But we also touch Russia.
Is it far to go to the Europe?
Actually, it's less far to go to Europe than it is to go to Florida, depending where you live, I think.
Oh, see?
I mean, I guess, but we technically would touch Russia too through the left side. There's some kind of tunnel or some kind
really?
of bridge. You can go to Russia from that side, from Alaska and that side, yeah.
Oh, why Russia
Something.
is everywhere?
Well, because the Russia, they're big. But you're right, Greenland is so... I don't even know why people would want to do with Greenland. Maybe to make like military base and stuff like this. But yeah, I think right now it's Denmark that own it, but...
European Union, meaning that adding Canada as 28th member would triple the geographic area of the European Union. But come on, Canada is not on the European continent, so how in the world could it be part of the European Union? The so-called Copenhagen criteria for EU enlargement has other prerequisites to joining the EU, such as democratic institutions, rule of law, a functioning market economy, the willingness and ability to comply with EU law. You'll notice being on the European continent is not a formal requirement to join. Article 49 of the Treaty on the EU says being...
Look, in Eurovision, they have Australia, they have Turkey, they have they could have Canada one day in Eurovision.
Yeah.
They seem to not have a lot of rules, and it's not a rules apparently, so why not? I think most Canadians would agree because we are always mashed in with the US. People always say that we're like it's pretty much the same thing, Canada and the US. And in a lot of area, culturally, it can be quite similar, but they have gone to the extreme and they have gone mad in the US. So in Canada, we want to distance ourselves from the madness going on right now in the US.
Oh.
So,
A quote, Europe.
because in Canada, even our conservative party is in the US would be considered almost like left-leaning. Because in the US, everything is so extreme.
European state is a requirement, but the term European state is left undefined. Part of the process of negotiating accession is determining if a state is sufficiently European. So might Canada qualify in a stretched definition of a European state based on heritage and its head of state? We'll get back to that. But let's not just pass over the raw geography here, because yeah, most of the EU's countries are indeed on the continent and share a land border. Ireland, Cyprus, and Malta are EU members that don't share a land border with another EU country, but nonetheless, their relative proximity allows ease of trade and movement of people. If, just for the sake of argument, New Zealand were to consider joining the European Union, the challenge of being so very far away would surely complicate that conversation, even if we consider New Zealand's European links. And that's especially true due to the geographic nature of defense policy, which we'll get to. One way to overcome the geographic issue for Canada is to simply turn the globe and realize that Canada isn't that far away. Cape Columbia, Canada's northernmost point, is only 2,400 kilometers away from Norgum, Finland, 1,500-ish miles. That's
See,
that's
24.
not far.
It's from the north to the south of Thailand, basically, in terms of distance.
half the distance between New York and California. The distance between St. John
See, half the distance between New York and California. So like I told you, it's like going to Florida for Canadian, basically.
Canada and Dublin is about the same as between Dublin and Cyprus. You can fly from Helsinki, Finland to Lisbon, Portugal within the EU in about 4.5 hours. And similarly, you can go from Montreal to Lisbon in 6.5 hours. It's different, but nothing crazy. Between Canada and the European Union are also Iceland, Greenland, the United Kingdom, Norway. While not EU member states, they are all closely linked to the EU. Take all these places in EU orbit and add Canada, and it starts to look like a genuinely formidable bloc. With a tripled territory, there would be a lot more land and sea to defend. On the other hand, the EU and Canada would become unified players in the Arctic at a crucial moment. So that's one piece here. Canada joining the EU is a bit of a stretch geographically, but let's return to the more challenging direct question. Could Canada qualify under Article 49 as a European state?
Where is Canada?
Canada
not
is
us?
right above the United States.
What?
I thought it is it Canada, not us, something. There's one, the one before this.
Don't poke the goose.
A lot more land and sea to defend. On the other hand, the EU and Canada would become unified players in the Arctic at a
I'm
crucial
stupid. Canada, not US.
Oh,
Oh my god, I'm so stupid.
okay. Not
Sorry.
us? Okay. No, that's fine. I was looking
So
for
that's
it.
one piece here. Canada joining the EU is a bit of a stretch geographically, but let's return to the more challenging direct question. Could Canada qualify under Article 49 as a European state? Canada is right above the United States.
No, but it's what I told you earlier is that in Canada, we are frustrated when we get compared to the US. Because in the US, there's a lot of things that, like, they have guns everywhere. In Canada, that would never work. They don't have free healthcare. There's a lot of things that we are socially progressive in Canada, and in the US, they are lagging behind a lot. So we don't want to be boxed in because there's a lot of things that they do there that we find absolutely insane. Like that we are completely in agreement with Europe that this is insane. Like,
And it feels like it. Canadian English and American English are hard to distinguish. And a lot of Canadian culture is based on finding ways to distinguish from America because the similarities can be so overwhelming. So yeah, at first glance, Canada joining the EU is about as odd as the United States joining the EU. Oceans and cultures divide. But Canada is a country with European roots, Western European to be specific. Now, I don't want to step into a big debate about colonialism, but suffice it to say that the British and French empires left their marks on Canada in ways that remain culturally and politically relevant, arguably more relevant than the legacy of those empires in the United States. And thus, Canada is a country that could plausibly join the EU and fit right in culturally. In Quebec, people tend to identify as Canadian, but also as a distinct Quebecois with deep French ties. If you were dropped in Quebec City or Montreal, you'd be forgiven for thinking you were in Europe. And French is one of the official languages of Canada, required for civil servants. French, by the way, is one of the two most prominent languages in the EU's bureaucracy. The other is English. And of course, most Canadians speak English thanks to British colonialism. But it's not just cultural, it's also political. Over the years, most of Canada has proudly demanded to keep the British monarch as head of state, even when becoming a dominion in the late 1800s. Contrast that with the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 19...
I don't think anyone in Canada care about the Queen and stuff like this. It's more like a symbol. What I was going to say, in Canada, I have not been for 10 years in Canada. I live in Thailand, but we are profoundly jealous of the Nordic country. Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark. I feel like we want to be like them, but we have a brother called the US that make it impossible for us to embrace the value of the Nordic country. I think this is what we inspire to be in Canada, but we cannot because of the influence of America.
Why?
We do a lot of trade with America. We don't want to piss them off too much, so we try to be like a little bit kind and not piss them off. If we start embracing values of social democracy too much, we're gonna piss off the US. And
1921, where the main sticking point for Irish Republicans was revulsion at keeping the King of England as their head of state. It caused the Irish Civil War. Canada hasn't been like that. The Governor General still represents the British monarch's interests in Canada, albeit ceremonially, and Canada has a parliament and prime minister, modeled off the Westminster system. Now, these two European components, French Canada and Anglo Canada, don't always see eye to eye. For example, French Canada was not universally enthused when Canada joined World Wars I and II alongside the UK, but still, Canada joined World Wars I and II long before the United States because of their deep ties to the UK and Europe. In fact, in World War I, Canada was automatically joined in the war when the UK declared. To hit home this point, I asked my friend Elise for a little help. I met her when I was working at the German embassy, and she was a French diplomat here in DC. Her thesis was coincidentally about Canada and the Great Wars in Europe.
So my question to you is, admitting that it is a bit of a stretch, because of Canada's roots in the British and French Empire, because of the way they participated in World War I and II, is there an argument to be made that Canada is more European than it first appears?
Well, it does have a more connected history to Europe that America can have, because America somehow, like in his identity, national building story is all about breaking the chains with Europe, where Canadians until very recently, and I think still nowadays, if you have a visit of the royals, there's a strong feeling. Actually, on the coins in Canada, you can still have the Queen and some of the symbolism. So there is a strong history with that. Now, Canada has only one border, and that's still a pretty big difference.
okay, that part about the history and the Queen and the is all bullshit. I don't know anyone in Canada that care about that. Okay, that's bullshit. The sentiment that we're closer to Europe, that's true, but not because of the Queen and the history and all of that. Okay, that's she just made something up, I think.
With any European country, but I like your comparison, and I think in many ways Canada could be the Switzerland of North America.
So the bottom line is that for history, for culture, for blood, Canada isn't as far from a European state as you'd initially think. Sure, it's a stretch, but there's a lot of subtlety here, and those deciding an application would get to engage with that subtlety because this would be legally unprecedented. I mentioned the UK several times. You probably already have thought, well, the UK left the European Union, so doesn't that cancel out one of Canada's European ties? To that I say, meh. The bottom line is that despite the fact that Canada joining the EU seems at first to be quite random, it's not, as we've seen, neither geographically nor culturally. But now things get even more complicated. Canada potentially joining the EU cannot be truly understood without addressing the sticky issue of defense. There's broad overlap between members of the European Union and members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO,
yeah.
a defense alliance founded in 1949 and traditionally led by the United States. In fact, 23 of the EU's 27 member states are also in NATO. But of course, NATO and the European Union are not the same thing. There are members of the EU that are not NATO, and there are members of NATO that are not in the EU. For example, Canada is in NATO, but not in the EU. So what would it mean for Canada to join the European Union now as a pre-existing member of NATO? Well, nothing. Sort of. Defense treaties as they exist today aren't the problem. Canada is in NATO, as are many European member states. If Canada joined the European Union, it would simply be another member in both institutions. The complication comes from growing US skepticism of the NATO alliance. What if the US formally leaves the NATO alliance? Or even, as things stand, what if a NATO country is attacked and the commander
Fairly confident that if the US leave, the Canada would join the European Union. That would be the last straw. I'm pretty sure, actually.
Chief of the United States orders the military to ignore any invocation of Article 5
that's
for
a nice
mutual
treat.
defense. Because President Trump, Vice President Vance, and the Secretary of Defense have left lots of open questions in the room about the U.S. fulfilling its treaty obligations, the EU has recently voted to empower member states to spend additional hundreds of billions on their own defense. Large European countries like Germany and France no longer only speak about meeting 2% of GDP for defense spending, as is expected for NATO, but as the head of NATO put it, considerably more than 3%, which some countries like Poland are already exceeding. It leads to a larger question for the European Union, one that I remember being battered around during my time at an EU member embassy here in Washington. Given the unprecedented threats from Russia and mixed messages from Trump, should the EU have its own military? Not just the German military or the Dutch military or the Estonian military, but a single entity controlled by Brussels. French President Emmanuel Macron called for such a true European army back in 2018 and has recently floated the idea of extending France's nuclear deterrent to its European allies. Which brings us to Canada. If Canada were to join the EU, it would need to make a judgment call about the direction European defense is headed. If the EU maneuvers towards a joint defense strategy or joint defense forces, Canada would presumably be part. Might some of Canada's armed forces one day be under the umbrella of Brussels? And how does Canada feel about that? Admittedly, it's speculation on speculation, but decisions would need to be made. In exchange for being part of European defense, Canada would receive the same, which until recently sounded far-fetched and unnecessary, but President
I'm fine with that. What you just said about like giving control to Brussels, creating a European army. I'm not patriotic enough to really care about like seeing that as a problem.
Trump said in February 2025 that he wasn't happy with the US-Canadian treaty on borders. And of course, he's constantly insisted that Canada should become the 51st state. Nearly impossible to distinguish
51st?
bloviating and
Yeah,
troll.
no, you're not aware of that? Trump wants America to become the 51 states of America. Like to be part of the US. It's where all that bullshit started.
Oh, well, I mean, well,
See?
it's close. So
See what I just said earlier about people thinking that America and Canada is the same thing? You're just proving my point again.
no, to be honest, like compared to the culture and like the people, like you can tell, right? Sometimes when you see American people or Canadian, they are really different in terms of like
But when you look at them,
their behavior, thing like that.
yeah, but
And
when
also, mostly when you saw the Canadian, they're mostly blonde sometimes.
why? Because I'm blonde?
No, like even your friend.
Well,
back
first
in the
of all,
day, thing like
20%
that.
of us speak French to begin with.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean.
I mean, you can tell the difference when you saw something, and also the way that they speak English. Of course, it's quite similar, but
except me, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the Canadian would speak like really, like polite. The way that they speak is really different from like American one. I mean, in terms of like my point of view, though.
She said it, not me. I'm not guilty, Your Honor. No, you're right. I'm
I'm not talking about you, though.
no, I agree. I'm just saying that it cannot come from me. It needs to come from you.
I mean, there's something different about them,
Bowling
Oh,
from
yeah, of course.
legitimate
Very
threats, but
different.
here we are. So when I was writing the script, I had a hard time determining if these defense questions were trickier than the economic questions. But as of writing, these defense issues are mostly speculative. Meanwhile, the most complicated piece of the puzzle is the very real trade war playing out between the US, Canada, Europe, and the rest of the world. The US trade war and renegotiations of USMCA are the most pressing reasons Canada may consider the heretofore unconsidered idea of joining the European Union. If the economic relationship enjoyed between the US and Canada hits the rocks any harder, Canada will likely want new.
You don't know the trade tariff right now? The US imposing tariff on product that Canada want to import from America to Canada and vice versa. So now if you import a car, if you import anything, eggs, that's why the price of everything is going up in both countries right now. Trump has decided to go to war with Canada because he's unhappy. And yeah, in America, the egg almost reached $1 per egg. But it's not really about that. The egg is because there was contamination problem. But the cost of a lot of things have gone up right now. There's a trade-off. It's difficult to explain, but basically...
What you guys gonna do?
Basically, Canada and the US are having some kind of a tariff war where the price of import product between both countries is going up a lot, and between the US and Mexico and the US and Europe, and Trump has gone crazy. It's hard to explain, but...
deals with
Basically, that's why they're talking about this right now. Because of what Trump has been doing the last few months, it escalated. Something like
viable trading partners. The same goes in reverse for the European Union as news of American tariffs move faster than headlines can keep up. Of course, if Canada were to join the EU, it would bring its $2.2 trillion economy with it, and by joining it would become the fourth largest economy by gross domestic product. The EU as a bloc is already Canada's third largest trading partner. Bring Canada into the European Union, make them part of the single market for goods and services, exchange free movement of people, the EU may soon rank even higher. There's a lot of assumptions there. First, that Canada joining the EU wouldn't affect trade with the UK, another large Canadian trading partner, which has, of course, left the EU. Second, because beginning accession negotiations to the European Union requires unanimous support from all 27 member states, Canada would need to hope none of its exports were threatening to domestic European firms that could then lean on their home governments to block Canada's accession. For example, a 2017 free trade agreement between Canada and the EU has yet to be fully implemented all these years later because 10 EU countries refused to ratify it. The entire EU would have to be...
Yeah, if I understand correctly, remember, if you join the European Union and now you need to trade with them, food and stuff like this, you cannot piss off other European countries that try to import within Europe too, their own product. And Canada is shipping from a long distance too. So it creates costs, you know, for the transport and things like this.
Serious about having Canada, but these economic details seem minor compared to this. As of now, about 77% of Canadian exports head to the United States. The Canadian government calls...
See? 77% of what Canada export go to the US right now.
Wow.
So they need to find a European country that's willing to take their product if it goes to that.
Quote, the most extensive trading relationship. We are each other's largest trading partners. Canada and the US are part of USMCA, formerly NAFTA, a free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Even if the Trump administration unilaterally sabotages the USMCA with tariffs, it would still be incredibly difficult for Canada to replace the volume of its free trade from the United States to Europe. Nonetheless, EU and Canadian officials have pledged to have each other's backs as Trump's trade war intensifies. And Canada has aimed to increase its non-US exports by 50%, according to Reuters, and a lot of that would be the European Union. In the meantime, there are initial murmurs of a European movement in Canada, and writers from the BBC and CBC and Economist have indulged the idea, like I'm now doing. Europe needs space and resources, read an Economist headline. Canada needs people. Let's deal. Some minor officials chimed in to endorse the conversation, and Germany's prominent former foreign minister, Sigmar Gabriel, said that the EU should indeed invite Canada to join. When news of that poll I mentioned, showing 44% of respondents thought Canada should join the EU, a European Commission spokesperson said the EU was honored, though she said she wouldn't comment further. On that note, is Canada joining the EU realistic or just wild speculation? I thought about that a lot, and part of the reason I decided to go ahead and write this is because the realm of possibilities has expanded in recent months. The world is realigning, and fast. Something unthinkable. Canada joining the EU, perhaps literally not even having been conceived until recently. It's now out there as something people are talking about. That said, realignment with Europe is more likely than literally joining. It's not likely, at least not a formal joining of Canada becoming the 28th member of the European Union. But what is more realistic, almost guaranteed by the behavior of the United States, is closer alignment between Canada and the EU. Depending on how much the trade war and other disputes escalate, perhaps a partnership of a depth impossible in other circumstances.
Yeah, there's a way to partner with the Europe without necessarily joining the European Union. You don't need to piss off the US by like stopping trading with them, but you can join. You don't have to join the European Union to like strengthen your alliance with Europe. And if in the future you're really forced to join the European Union, you just join. In the meantime, you should just try to create stronger connection with some country in Europe.
Yeah. Poor them though.
Poor who?
Poor Canada.
Why?
Well, you're in the middle of something else. But wait, in that continent, right? Except the US and Canada, with country
Mexico?
that
They're pretty big too.
Mexico, pretty big, right? But all the small country around, like the economy is not good, right?
South? Yeah, but it's not huge trade partner compared to like Mexico, US, and like Europe. Because remember that 77% of all the export of Canada go to the US. So it's basically you lose a big partner. So if you stay in the if you stay out of the European Union, but you intensify, you reduce the 77% to like 50%, you can already check if it's like possible to one day join the European Union. If 50% to the US make your economy in Canada much weaker, you know that you're always going to depend on the US, you know. You need to try it on a smaller scale first to see if it works, and then, you know. The thing is, he's saying that the window might be right now because when Trump is no longer like the president, maybe it's going to get better between Canada and the US. So I think a lot of people would say just wait a little bit, that the madness go away.
He's crazy. He's tricked everyone, even China, everything.
Yeah.
Well, it's happened since he like get into the position though. That one he said that he gonna like what is it put everything up for the tax, export, import, whatever thing.
Yeah, and he did not talk about China. I think Canada could have a great relation with China. China are technologically they're going next level. They have a pretty strong influence. To me, that would be a great partner also, China.
Yeah. And I think a lot of Chinese in Canada too.
Yeah, and if you look at like Chinese impact on Asia overall, I mean, China is really going into the right direction compared to the US. If you compare both direction, right? I mean, in the US, a lot of people view China as like the big villain, right? And then you look at here, we kind of view the US and we're like, what the US is doing is insane, you know? Yeah. I wish that more people would see in the US that what they're doing is kind of crazy. If you're not from the US and you look at it, you're like, this is crazy. It makes no sense. A lot of the things that they're doing. So, well, thank you for the video. If there's more, you did not suffer that much.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh.
You survived.
Oh, true.
You did not die? Okay, well, thank you for watching. Okay, see you very soon.